Hi, everyone. I am your host, Brittany, and welcome to another episode of One Hot Mess. So, today we are going to continue reading No Mud, No Lotus. We are on part 3, Looking Deeply, Understanding the Pain. When we are in crisis or pain, we need to first take care of the immediate need, which is that crisis. Once our mindful energy has soothed our suffering, we can begin to look more deeply into its nature and sources, just as when we have a headache, acknowledging its existence and understanding its causes helps us find the appropriate remedy for it. So understanding eases our pain and helps us into compassion. The important mindfulness practice of cultivating understanding means, first of all, understanding suffering, the suffering inside us and the suffering of others. A human being without understanding is a human being without compassion, utterly alone, cut off, and isolated. To connect with others, however, we first have to be willing to look deeply into ourselves. The pain of our ancestors. Some of our ill being comes from hurt and pain in our own life, but some has been transmitted to us by our ancestors. Think of a stalk of corn that grows from a seed. Each ear of corn, each leaf contains the initial seed. In every cell of the plant, that seed is there. And just as the plant of corn is the continuation of the seed of corn, you are the continuation of your parents. When you see a picture of yourself as a 5-year-old child, you may ask yourself, am I the same person as that child? The answer isn't yes or no. Your form, your feelings, your mental formations, your perceptions, and your consciousness are quite different from when you were that child. It's clear you aren't exactly that same person. But if you say that you are a completely different person, that's equally wrong. You and that young child are with each other. Before my mother gave birth to me, she had a miscarriage. The child who didn't arrive that time, was he my brother or was he me? We aren't the same, but we aren't totally different. My feet have been transmitted to me by my ancestors. When I walk with my own feet, but these feet are also theirs. I can see the hand of my mother in my hand. I can see the arms of my father in my arms. I am my parents' continuation. There are those who have lost their biological parents or never knew them and had no chance to connect with them in person. There are also people who grew up with their blood relatives whose parents are still alive, yet they are unable to communicate with them. In all these situations, even if you don't have a regular interpersonal relationship with your parents or your ancestors, your body and mind contain their suffering and their hopes as well as your own. So if you have suffering in you and you don't know where it comes from, looking deeply, you may see that this is the suffering of your ancestors handed down from one generation to another because no one knew how to recognize, embrace, and heal it. It's not your fault, nor is it theirs. Many people are angry at their parents because of the suffering they experienced as children. They say that, man, I don't want anything to do with him. You may believe that your father is outside of you, but your father is also inside of you. Your father is present in every cell of your body. You cannot remove your father from you. It's impossible. When he suffered, you suffered. And when you suffer, he suffers. Getting angry with your father, you're getting angry with yourself. The suffering of a parent is the suffering of the child. Looking deeply is a chance to transform and heal this suffering and stop the cycle. So part of looking deeply into our suffering is to know that it is not ours alone. When we are able to embrace our suffering, we are also embracing our ancestors, and the healing goes back through the generations. When we practice mindful breathing to know how to recognize, embrace, and transform our pain, we do it for them as well as for us. Then we can heal not only our own suffering and that of our ancestors, but we can also avoid transmitting this suffering to our loved ones, to our children and their children. One unnecessary suffering that we can let go of is the suffering of fear. So many of us walk around with the pain and agitation of useless fear, whether that is the fear of dying, fear of hunger, injury, or loss, fear of what might happen if we do the wrong thing, or fear of being hurt by or of hurting someone we care about. Many people suffer due to the fear of dying. We want to live forever. We don't want to pass from being into non-being. This is understandable. If you believe that one day you will cease to exist altogether, it can be very scary. But if you take the time to still the activities of the body and mind and look deeply, you may see that you're dying right this very moment. You think that you will die in a few years or 20 years or 30 years. That's not true. You're dying now. You have been dying all the time. It's actually very pleasant to die, which is also to live. There are many cells inside your body that are dying as you read these words. 50 to 70 billion cells die each day in the average human adult. You're too busy to organize funerals for all of them. At the very same time, new cells are being born, and you don't have time to sing happy birthday to them. If old cells don't die, there's no chance for new cells to be born. So death is a very good thing. It's very crucial for birth. You are undergoing birth and death in this very moment. While most people are intensely afraid of dying, there are also people who are weary of living. They get bored after 50, 70, or maybe only 20 or 30 years. They find life unbearable and are seeking non-being. Some of them think that suicide is the way to end the suffering and to pass from the realm of being into non-being. Both of these preconceptions cause suffering because they ignore the reality that life and death always go together. You can't take one out of the other. Even after your so-called death, you will continue in some way. Deep looking can dismantle these kinds of notions. There is no birth and death. Everything dies and renews itself all the time. When you get that kind of insight, you no longer tire yourself out with anxiety and aversion. When we are full of fear, we are often completely focused on preventing the event we dread. We forget that joy is also possible even in an unpredictable world. We believe that we need to obtain a certain diploma or career in order to be safe and be a success. There are people who are victims of this kind of success. They get the things they work so hard to achieve, and then they find themselves trapped in ways they had not anticipated. But no one is ever a victim of his or her happiness. Many of us live in communities where everyone has a roof over their head and enough food to eat, and no one is scared of bombs dropping on them. Yet people are still suffering. This is because we have forgotten or misplaced our deepest aspiration. Many of us slog through life without conscious awareness or intention. We set ourselves a course and we barrel ahead without stopping to ask whether this path is fulfilling our most important goals. That's partly because many of us believe that happiness is not possible in the here and now. We think we need to struggle now so that we will be happy in the future. So we postpone happiness and try to run into the future and attain the conditions of happiness that we don't have now. If you breathe in and bring your mind home to your body, you can recognize immediately the many conditions of happiness that you already have. You can look deeply at your true aspiration and get the insight. I don't need to run into the future in order to be happy. We all have the habit of running, every one of us. This habit creates tension not only in the body but in the mind and is a major source of our suffering. Many of us believe that we can only be happy if we have a great deal of power, fame, wealth, and sensual pleasures. But when we look around and we see that there are people who have plenty of these things, yet they are not happy, these objects of desire are not real conditions of happiness. Looking deeply, we can recognize that habit energy of running and envision what things would be like if we didn't let it push us to run anymore. Everyone has a strong motivation that fuels us and knows when it's a healthy one, brings us joy. When I was 12, I knew I wanted to be a monk. At the age of 16, I left my mother and family to become ordained as a novice monk. I loved my mother so much, I wanted to be near her. On the other hand, I knew my greatest happiness would be to live as a monk. I had to sacrifice the good times I would have spent with my mother, and I was sad about it, but I didn't let any fear of loss hold me back because I knew I was on the path of fulfilling my true aspiration. If we haven't taken the time to stop, come home to ourselves, and look deeply, we may not know what brings us our deepest happiness. Perhaps we are working hard at success in one area, but our deepest aspiration is to work in another field or help people in another way. We need to stop and ask, can I realize my deepest aspiration if I pursue this path? What is really preventing me from taking the path I most deeply desire? Developing understanding and compassion. Just as the well tended compost becomes a flower garden, when we take care of and look deeply into our sorrow, it transforms into understanding and compassion. The way to understanding is first to listen to yourself because the roots of our suffering are deep and connected with the roots of the suffering of others. Usually we think that other people, such as our parents, our partner, or people at work are to blame for our hurt. But looking more deeply, we can see the true sources of our own suffering, and we can also see that the person who we think is out to get us is a victim of his or her own suffering. Understanding our own hurt allows us to see and understand the suffering of others. Looking without judgment, we can understand, and compassion is born. Transformation, is possible. When you are upset with someone, it may seem at first that this other person has no reason to suffer. His life may seem happy and carefree, and he may have all the things in his life that you think you want. But when you are able to look deeply enough, you will see the suffering in him. Sitting and walking mindfully, sorry guys, you direct your attention to the causes underlying the other person's behavior. You see clearly that he has a lot of pain inside and doesn't know how to handle it. That is why he suffers so much and makes the people around him suffering. What he needs is help, not punishment. If you stay with this practice, the suffering of anger or jealousy in you will dissipate and the flower of the compassion will be born. When there is no more blame or criticism in your eyes, when you are able to look at others with compassion, you see things very differently. You speak differently. The other person can sense that you are truly seeing her and understanding her, and that already eases her pain significantly. Even a child can look deeply and see his parents have different nope. So sorry. Once again, that his parents have difficulties and don't know how to handle their own pain. Their suffering overflows out into people around them, including even especially the ones they love. An understanding of suffering helps anger to be transformed, and when compassion is born into your heart, you naturally want to reach out to help others suffer less. Understanding and compassion are not for somebody else to cultivate. They can lead you to heal and increase your happiness. A human being without understanding and compassion isn't a happy being. Without compassion and understanding, you are utterly alone and cut off. You can't relate to any other human being. I wouldn't want to be in a world without any suffering because then there would be no compassion and understanding either. If you haven't suffered hunger, you can't appreciate having something to eat. If you haven't gone through a year, or I'm so sorry again, if you haven't gone through a war, you don't know the value of peace. This is why we should not try to run away from one unpleasant thing after another. Holding our suffering, looking deeply into it, and transforming it into compassion, we find a way to happiness. With mindfulness, the feelings that have been painful and difficult transform into something beautiful, the wondrous healing balm of understanding and compassion. Easing communication. Our most basic difficulty is that sometimes we lack good communication inside ourselves. We don't understand ourselves. In our body, there are conflicts and tensions, and we cannot resolve them. Instead of stopping and looking deeply, we are running as far away as possible from the loneliness, grief, sadness, anger, and emptiness that we feel we cannot bear. If we are in this situation and we find ourselves unable to communicate with others, that's normal. They aren't communicating with themselves, and we aren't communicating with ourselves. So, is it any wonder we have difficulty communicating with each other? The situation doesn't call for blame or punishment, it calls for understanding and compassion. With the practice of mindfulness, starting out with our mindful breathing, we recognize that suffering is there in us, and suffering is also there in the other person. We ourselves need help. The other person also needs help. Nobody needs punishment. So when you get angry and you suffer, don't try to say or do something to punish the other person because there's a lot of suffering in her already, and punishing her won't improve the situation at all. The most effective way to show compassion to another is to listen rather than talk. You have an opportunity to practice deep, compassionate listening. If you can listen to the other person with compassion, your listening is like a salve for her wound. In the practice of compassionate listening, you listen with only one purpose, which is to give the other person the chance to speak out and to suffer less. This practice requires steady concentration and mindful breathing in and out to refrain from interrupting and attempting to correct what you hear. While the other person speaks, you may hear a lot of bitterness, wrong perception, and accusation in her speech. If you allow these things to touch off the anger in you, you'll lose your capacity to listen deeply. Instead, hold on to your true purpose and remind yourself, listening like this, my sole aim is to help the other person suffer less. She may be wrong, full of wrong perceptions, but I won't interrupt her. If I jump in with my perspective on things to correct her, it will become a debate, not a practice of deep listening. That kind of mindfulness helps you to keep your compassion alive and protects you from having the seed of anger in you touched off. Who knows? You may be the first one who has listened deeply to her like that. Um, you might say something such as, "It's not my intention to make you suffer. I didn't understand your suffering. I'm sorry. Please help me by telling me about your struggles and your difficulties. I need help in understanding you." Many of us are no longer able to use this kind of language with the other person because we have suffered so much. But when we consciously practice deep listening and loving speech, so much healing and happiness is possible. If you have a loved one who suffers, you can be compassionate, a compassionate ally for them. You can offer to sit down with them when he has to have a difficult conversation with somebody, either in person or over the phone, every time the person he's speaking with says something that you think might trigger your loved one's anger or sadness, you can squeeze your loved one's hand. This is your bell of mindfulness. Say to your loved one ahead of time, when you feel that squeeze, remember you don't have to say anything. Take it as a reminder to breathe in and out 3 times slowly, paying attention to your breath. Try to smile. Maybe the person you're talking with will be very surprised by your quality of listening. Just breathe in and out 3 times. Don't say anything and smile. Play the role of the bell of mindfulness. You're squeezing the hand is like a bell lovingly calling your friend to come back to himself. That squeeze means I am here for you. You don't need to do anything but breathe. And that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure to hit that follow button and share one hot mess with a friend. And I will talk to you guys next time. Have a beautiful day.